Happy Mother's Day. Please be seated. In the name of the God who does new things. Amen. The Easter season is the only time of the Christian year when the church gives us an opportunity to listen to the book of Acts instead of a reading from the Old Testament. Now, I have a friend who's an Old Testament professor who grumbles about that every year, but I confess that I'm always glad to have that yearly reminder of what it was like to follow Jesus when he was no longer on the road with his friends. For these last few weeks, we've been thinking about what Easter meant to those followers of his who watched with him as he died, a tragic end to the one that they'd hoped would change the world. And 3 days later, when Easter changed everything, and after they met him, maybe they thought it would never stop. Maybe they assumed that whenever things got really hard, the risen Christ would show up again, just as he had over the days and the weeks after Easter, to restore their confidence, to show them the way, to tell them what to do and what to say. Well, that didn't happen. The appearances stopped. On this Thursday, we'll remember that last day when Christ made his last appearance to his friends and returned to the God who had sent him. No more surprise meetings on the road. No more surprise picnics on the seashore. No more surprises as they're locked in for fear of what the crowds might do. And the book of Acts tells us what it was like for those first followers of his after Easter had come and gone. For Peter and James and John and Mary Magdalene and Jesus' own mother and his brother James, and also for those who came after them, especially Paul, who took the message of Jesus from where it had started to faraway places. But even Paul didn't usually venture too far from his Jewish roots. Whenever he went to a new city, he found the nearest synagogue, and he shared what he had come to believe with whoever would listen, doing his best to persuade them that, yes, Jesus was the Messiah they'd been waiting for, that yes, he had died, yes, he was buried, and yes, God had raised him from the dead. And most of the time, the people he met didn't believe him. Sometimes they gave him a really hard time, with Paul getting beaten up or even put in jail. But sometimes they did believe him, and what had started as a tiny movement of Jews in Jerusalem didn't take very long before it was growing into a movement that was spreading all through the Roman Empire. But this morning, we met Paul in a very different setting than the one he's used to. He's made his way to Athens, the heart of Greek culture, a city that was really proud of its long academic tradition. It's no surprise that the English word philosophy comes from Greek. It means the love of wisdom. And that's how people in Athens thought of themselves. They were lovers of wisdom. And Paul is a rabbi. He's used to drawing what he teaches from the Jewish scriptures. That doesn't work in Athens. Paul has to start with where people are, not where he wishes they were. And as intellectual as the people in Athens prided themselves on being, they also considered themselves religious. Even today, if you go to Athens, the temple of the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, still dominates the skyline. But Paul doesn't mention Athena. He starts his sermon by pointing out that he'd seen a statue dedicated to an unknown god. With all the gods and goddesses of Greek myth, Paul was convinced, and I think he was right, that they'd missed the point. And that's his starting point. That's where he begins. With all the shrines, all the stories, all the statues, people still haven't figured it out. Because on our own, we probably never will figure it out. But, says Paul, have I got good news for you? I'm going to tell you who that unknown God is. That God, the one you didn't know, with all your stories and all your myths and all your temples and all your philosophy, that God is the one who doesn't need temples and doesn't look like you and me. So don't think artists and sculptors are going to give you gods to worship. The real God, the unknown God that I'm introducing you to, is the source of all life, the source of all peoples. That's the God you've been looking for, and maybe you came close to finding, but things have changed now. It's time to get things right because God has done something new. And God has done something new through the person that God has chosen, and we can believe it because God raised him from the dead. And that's as far as Paul got. Because when he got to Easter, he lost them, at least most of them. Some people rolled their eyes and walked away. Other people were a little bit more polite, and they said, well, that's an interesting story, but we'd like to hear more, but we have to go now. And they disappeared too. Only a few people in Athens stayed long enough to become followers of Jesus. Because the idea that somebody could actually die and be buried and then raised from the dead made no sense. And the reason it didn't make any sense was because it had never happened. And you know, for 2,000 years, lots of people have rolled their eyes when they get to the Easter story because it doesn't seem possible. It sounds like fiction or fantasy or wishful thinking or just plain foolishness. Anything but reality. Anything but the truth. Anything but wisdom. I don't think Paul ever quite got over his experience in Athens because when he wrote to the church that he'd founded in Corinth, he still remembered how so many Greek people who treasured their wisdom rolled their eyes at Easter. Maybe you and I sometimes wonder too, did it really happen? Did Jesus really die? Was he really buried? And did he really meet his friends all over again? And when you think about it, there's only one reason why we should wonder, and it turns out maybe we're not so different from those people in Athens who wondered 2,000 years ago, because that's not what we expect to happen when people die. They're supposed to stay dead. And when we give in to that kind of wondering, when we ask ourselves, is Easter really true? What we're really assuming is that if something has never happened, it's never going to happen for the first time. And it's quite true that in all the history of the human race, nobody before Jesus had ever been raised from the dead as he was. But then we also believe that there was never anybody else quite like Jesus before him. There was never anybody so open to God that when we listen to Jesus, we can believe what he says in a unique way. Are we really prepared to say that just because God had never done anything before, that means God can never do it? Sometimes people wonder about the Easter stories as we hear them year by year because they're so different. People never seem to recognize Jesus, and even when they do, each one of the four Gospels gives us a different cast of characters. When they don't even agree with who saw him first, how can we trust the stories? Well, I think those differences are one of the best reasons why we should take the stories so seriously. It shouldn't surprise us that by the time people got around to writing the Gospels, memories were a little shaky, and people weren't quite sure what they'd heard from the eyewitnesses. But people honored the stories because they believed them. They honored the stories way too much to fix them. No proofreading, no editing, no AI correcting. These memories are too precious to be tampered with. God raised Jesus from the dead, and the details, the how, are gloriously irrelevant. Most of the Athenians thought they were too smart to believe that God could do it. But when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, this is what he said: Jews ask for signs, and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block for Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. You know something? I think Paul was right. Amen.